action, they will not be the last. The use of tactical liquidation is not new to this state. You will recall Cleary's in 2015, when similarly staff who had given a lifetime of service were unceremoniously dumped by their employers. They were left high and dry. They didn't receive their statutory redundancy lump sum. They never got monies owed in lieu of notice of redundancy or holiday pay, and the state was left to foot the bill. Well, this is the blueprint for what is happening in Debenhams. And there needs to be immediate intervention by the state and by government. Because you will recall that in the case of Cleary's, at that time we all said that this could never happen again, but it has. So now is the time for immediate and effective action. What the workers are looking for is not unreasonable. It's necessary. They want government to intervene with and to engage with KPMG, the liquidators, appointed by the UK parent company. They want government to directly intervene with the parent company itself. They want Debenhams to simply honour previous agreements to pay 2 weeks redundancy per year of service in addition to the statutory redundancy. They want to be treated with respect. They do not want a situation where Debenhams can simply walk away. Taoiseach, I want to put it to you that it is now urgent that the government act. It is also urgent that we legislate. And I want you to move beyond the words that you said yesterday, which were equivocal and non-committal. I want to hear a firm commitment from you today that you will act immediately to directly support these workers, and you will also act immediately to legislate.
Deputy Taoiseach, please.
I thank the Deputy for raising the issue and the question in relation to the Debenhams workers. And my response yesterday wasn't lacklustre and was not equivocal in terms of how Debenhams have treated their workers in Ireland. They've treated them very, very badly and very poorly. And the state will do everything it can to support the workers who have been made redundant by the company in the manner that you have described. Secondly, it has been accepted, and the programme for government outlines the necessity to review legislation, particularly in terms of the utilisation by companies to lay workers off, but by the trading side of the company becoming insolvent and separating out the assets and then not being available to facilitate the payment of redundancies to workers. And there's a commitment to the programme for government to review the Companies Acts and the legislation with a view to closing off those vehicles or those mechanisms by which companies can treat workers so shabbily and so badly. And thirdly, governments arbitrarily cannot intervene in liquidation situations as easily as you have suggested. But that said, Debenhams should do the right thing by their workers and should pay the agreed redundancy levels that had been agreed in previous engagements. And there are obligations in relation to the company in terms of its workers. We will do everything we possibly can, obviously within the law, to support the workers and to give every particular resource we can to them to enable them to secure their rights and entitlements, but also future employment and future supports that they may require to enable them to get over, to deal with what has been a very, very difficult and traumatic situation for them as workers, and they've been treated very poorly in relation to it. The government is committed to looking at that legislation and changing it.
Taoiseach, Deputy MacDonald.
Well, you see, Taoiseach, here is the problem. The state and the government has not intervened in the appropriate way to protect these workers. And I would remind you that since 2015, you have been saying that there has to be a review and a change to the legislation. I have a direct quote from you here. You said the state must intervene. This was in relation to Cleary's. The most effective intervention is legislative, and you challenged at the time for a review of the law to ensure that this type of behaviour cannot continue. Now we're 5 years on, and you're still talking about reviewing legislation. That's simply not good enough. You may be new to the office of Taoiseach, but you are not new to government. In fact, you supported the last administration for 4 long and very difficult years in which they did precisely zilch, nothing, to ensure that this type of scandalous situation wouldn't happen again.
Thank you, Deputy.
So this afternoon, Ceann Comhairle, we will publish legislation in line with the Cahill Duffy report to prevent these kind of tactical liquidations and insolvencies. And I would ask that the government support this legislation, and furthermore that we make time before we rise for the summer to ensure that the law that is long overdue to protect the Debenhams workers and all of the other vulnerable workers out there at this time of economic crisis, that we have the right laws on our books to ensure that this type of scandal cannot happen again. But that requires, Taoiseach, you to act, not to contemplate, not to push things down the pipe, not to hide behind complexity, but to lead from the front, to act and to legislate.
Taoiseach, please.
Very disingenuous and dishonest in your presentation. I have not been in government I wasn't in government in 2015, haven't been in government over the last number of years. We're in government 1 week. That's the reality. But that's the great political untruth and mantra that you and your party have been peddling for quite some time. It's disingenuous, and it does a disservice to the issue here. It doesn't help anybody to be making this kind of disingenuous political attacks on other political parties. It might suit you politically, but it doesn't actually help anybody, and it doesn't help the workers. No, it's in the programme for government that there's a commitment to legislate in the situation in relation to the separation of property from trading entities that is being used. And the Minister and the Taoiseach involved will be examining that legislation. And that will happen. But it's not going to deal with the Debenhams workers' plight.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
And you know that, Deputy. And I think it's important that when we're dealing with workers who've gone through a very traumatic situation, it's not to try and unrealistically raise expectations and blame everybody else when it's the company that's fundamentally at fault here in terms of its behaviour towards the worker.
Thank you,
it hasn't been the outgoing government's fault, it's not this government's fault. But what this government can do is certainly look at the legislation in dealing with it.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach. Now we move to the regional group, and I ask Deputy Denis Naughton to address the House, please.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, this week it has been agreed that the Chief Medical Officer, Dr Tony Holohan, is to be awarded the Freedom of the City of Dublin, an honour he rightly deserves. Together now with the now Taoiseach, the now Minister for Further and Higher Education, he was the steady hand we needed as we navigated our way through the pandemic, and the nation drew reassurance from his calm demeanour during his daily briefings. I believe it is time now, the time is now right to also recognise the work of all frontline health workers. Many of our doctors, nurses, healthcare assistants place themselves at risk to go to work every day, to keep us safe and to care for those who are seriously ill. Many of them made huge personal sacrifices during this time, including moving out of their homes and away from their families in some cases to keep them safe, while continuing to provide care not alone to those with COVID, but also others who needed health care during uncertain times. Taoiseach, these healthcare workers have worked long hours in extremely difficult circumstances, and we must now stop and recognise the work that they have done on behalf of us all. These people have been selfless, and our country owes them a great debt of gratitude. If it is not possible to reward them with pay increases or some form of bonus system, then I believe at a very minimum we should offer them additional paid leave, time to spend with their families, they may have sacrificed precious family time with, or indeed time out to recover from the physical and emotional tiredness that they must undoubtedly be feeling. Taoiseach, would you not agree that now is the time for us to come together as a country and offer our healthcare workers more than a round of applause, but to acknowledge their work and their sacrifices?
Taoiseach, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Deputy, in terms of your question and your presentation. And I would agree with you, particularly in terms of the contribution that frontline health service staff and those in the background have made to the fight against COVID-19 and in effectively contributing to the suppression of the virus for now and a very low level of community transmission. And I also share your admiration for the work of Tony Holohan, the Chief Medical Officer, and the calm leadership that he gave. And I think we all wish him our very best at this time, and also to the outgoing Taoiseach and outgoing Minister for Health. And without question, the healthcare workers, particularly in your acute hospitals setting in the early phase of COVID-19, put themselves at risk for the betterment of their fellow citizens. And we saw in the RT Investigates programme the intensity of that commitment, the intensity of that contribution, and the huge emotional trauma that also went with it in terms of the additional duties that nursing staff and doctors had to take upon themselves to communicate with families who could not be near their loved ones. I think what it also illustrates is the value of a very strong public service and a good quality public service. And that's something we should never underestimate in this country. In a time of crisis, it's the state fundamentally intervenes through the quality and expertise of its public service. In the first instance, that is why the government has committed to honouring, notwithstanding the enormous financial difficulties that the state will be in, the pay agreements that will fall due in the autumn. It's to recognise the contribution of the public service in general to helping the country come through COVID-19. And it also applies to others in terms of An Garda Síochána and other frontline workers, and indeed those in retail and so on, who also came to the front line to help people. So the government will examine your suggestion and your proposal. I can't make commitments here today. I will discuss it with others. But I am conscious of the point that you have raised and the importance of recognition of people who went to, in my view, exceptional lengths to help people on an individual basis, and by so doing, helping the country at large get through this crisis.
Taoiseach, Deputy Naughton.
Taoiseach, thank you for your response. Taoiseach, one way in which we can help to relieve pressure on our frontline workers is by eliminating trolleys in our hospitals. In the last month, patients and trolleys is something that we have again started to see within our hospitals across this country. We need to take action now to address the bed crisis. And that is the very minimum we owe to frontline healthcare staff across Ireland. Take, for example, Portiuncula Hospital in Ballinasloe. Since the start of June, on average, there have been 8 patients on trolleys every single day. 10% of the beds at the hospital have been lost as a direct result of the measures to reduce the risk of infection from COVID-19. And we need to see direct and immediate action taken to address this problem. Taoiseach, would you not agree that our healthcare workers have been under enough pressure for the last 4 months from a virus that we couldn't control? Let's not add to that. Let's take action now on something that we can control.
Thank you, Deputy Naughton.
Well, first of all, in terms of Portiuncula, I think they've had a net reduction of about 8 beds because, as you have said, the impact of COVID-19 and their desire to prevent the spread of the the virus across the hospital and to have sufficient isolation facilities for suspected cases and indeed any particular case that they have in terms of a patient with COVID. You're correct in saying that emergency presentations in our emergency departments is back more or less where it was prior to COVID. It's been steadily rising in all acute hospitals. And that does pose significant challenges over the coming months, because on the one hand we do want to resume services, non-COVID services in particular, as best as we can. But clearly, with living with COVID and COVID being an ever-present, we will have to develop innovative approaches to making sure that we keep emergency department attendances much lower than would have been acceptable in previous times. So where hospitals were at 95% prior to COVID, which is too high in any event in emergency departments and in terms of overcrowding, the ideal situation would be back to 80% to facilitate any spike in numbers or surge in that regard. So we're very conscious of that, and the HSE is developing a plan now which should be published by the end of the month in relation to its strategy in terms of resuming services and also dealing with those crunch issues in terms of overcrowding,
Thank you very much.
particularly in the emergency departments.
Deputy Matty McGrath, please.
The whole situation around mental health services in Tipperary is a very, very serious issue. Indeed, it had been a serious issue all along prior to COVID. I want to wish your new Minister, Deputy Mary Butler, the very, very best, a very good appointment. I look forward to engaging and working with her. And indeed, she has agreed to a request from Deputy Cahill and myself to come and visit Clonmel. We have not one single mental health long-stay bed in Tipperary. Vision for Change was a disaster. We lost our wonderful St. Michael's, which was an acute, and which was many, many people used it for decades. It was closed. Last Minister for Health, Mental Health, Minister Dáil, acknowledged that it was a mistake. He admitted, and his officials now admit, that we have a deficit of 25 long-stay mental health beds in South Tipperary alone. And Kilkenny just hasn't space for us, hasn't room for us. They have to cover the whole South East. I want to salute the volunteers in Clonmel and the people that are picking up the flag and the Tipperary Fight for Mental Health Services. June and all her team at River Shore Patrol. Father Michael Toomey, who will be meeting Minister Butler. She's agreed to meet him. Joe Leahy and all his team at Seesaw. And there are volunteers doing the work and the support that ordinary people, that the services should be providing. This is not fair. It's not right. This COVID has put a massive pressure on people's mental health and people's lives. So, Taoiseach, we need action. Words anymore won't suffice. And as I said, we need those beds. We need our crisis house to be expanded. We're waiting for that as well. And we need a specialist nurse to be appointed on 24/7 basis at the A&E that can assess patients that present with mental health difficulties and that want to, admittance. Many have been sent home, and sadly, many have died. Outside of Dublin, Tipperary is the highest issue of suicides with mental health issues, and that is an appalling vista at this time in our country. Clonmel, unfortunately, is the highest within the county. It's just not acceptable. People are crying out for help. Volunteers and families are trying to support, but there are no services that have been turned away. I had a case last weekend where a person was sent around from Billy to Jack and could go nowhere, sent home again, threatening to self-harm. Her family hugely upset and huge disquiet about that. So we need those beds. But above all, we need Vision for Change. I know has been replaced now, 3 years out of date. But it didn't. Gave us no change or no hope in Tipperary. It was a failure. And we need those beds. It's acknowledged by the Minister, former Minister Daly, and the HSE officials that those beds are a deficit of those beds. But we need them now. We could find 600,000 recently for COVID to do up St. Michael's. They refused point blank to allow patients back into it or to have even a space there. One room for people that were presenting to the adjacent St. Joseph's Hospital with mental health crisis to be in there. Now it's kitted out for COVID. Thankfully, and hopefully it won't be used. We accept accept that, we acknowledge the good work done there, but this must be kept open. What is proved now is where there's a will, there's a way. The money was found to open it for COVID. We must have that facility reopened. The 25 beds that have been, 25 to 30 beds that have been prepared there, en-suite rooms, must be used to treat the people of Tipperary, West Waterford. Must be used because they need those services, and we can't have the terrible situation of suicides. Too many families, too many lives have been lost. Taoiseach, please.
Touching any, we're on. I didn't go near it. That's my point. I want to thank the Deputy for raising what is a very serious issue in terms of mental health services in general, and in terms of specifically in Clonmel and in Tipperary. And I think there are two dimensions to the mental health services. One, obviously, is physical facilities, acute capacity, in other words, acute beds in particular facilities. And I know the South East in general and Tipperary have been short of acute capacity in mental health for quite some time. The other aspect of it, of course, is securing the necessary personnel and staff to provide the services once you have the facility. And it seems to me, having worked in the area and been engaging with previous ministers and the HSE, that there seems to have been a significant challenge in terms of recruiting and securing qualified personnel. And I think, and welcome the fact that you've already had an engagement with the Minister, Mary Butler, in relation to this. I have no doubt that she will respond diligently to the points that you and all your colleagues in Tipperary have. And in relation to this. Now, in terms of St. Michael's, I think you have said that the physical improvements have happened. I think that we will have to ensure that we can get the right personnel in place and recruit the professionals. But in addition to that, I think we must also work with non-governmental organisations, the NGOs, some of whom you've described, who can help in providing services to people who are on waiting lists for far too long in terms of getting access to very basic mental health services. I'm particularly conscious that COVID-19 will create additional burdens in terms of mental health need, and many people, it will have an impact on many people, and I think that's something we need to improve our services to respond to. So I have heard what you've had to say. I know that yourself and Deputy Cahill, I believe, are meeting with the Minister, and I'll certainly work with the Minister as well to see what we can do specifically to try and improve the situation in Tipperary.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy McGrath.
Good morning, Taoiseach, I thank you for your reply and response. I'm asking you, have you the will to find a way? It has been a failure since Vision for Change. A mental health crisis 24/7 nurse was appointed, was recruited, but didn't get the go-ahead because of the embargo on mental health places. This embargo is not fair when people are losing their lives. It's just shocking. It has been transformed now for COVID, the St. Michael's Hospital. It can't be allowed. And I believe the people of the county won't allow it to be closed when COVID passes. We have to have those beds used. And we have to have the staff and the qualified personnel that are there. Because the community service that were promised, the Rolls Royce service were promised when we closed St. Michael's as part of Vision for Change, hasn't got into gear. And we've lost too many lives and too many families have been distraught, and devastation and havoc. So we have much more pressure on people now, financially, business people and everybody, with the COVID and with the crisis situation. So we need those beds, and we need for you and your Minister to find a way and have the will to find it.
Taoiseach, please.
Yeah, first of all, I do have the will to deal with this issue. And secondly, as I said, the Minister will work with you in relation to this. But I also say to you that every region needs an acute capacity, but don't underestimate the importance of strong community-based mental health as well. In my view, you need the continuum, and I think the better and the stronger the community health presence is, the less the need for acute admissions. And I can recall a long time ago a meeting with the services in Monaghan, for example, which was at that stage one of the leaders in terms of developing the non-acute side of mental health services. And it is extremely important that we've developed both in tandem, because one has a direct impact on the other. And I take your points.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach. Now we move finally to Deputy Joan Collins, please.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, in 2018-2019, the families of children who have the rare muscle wasting disease, spinal muscular atrophy, launched a campaign to have the drug Spinraza approved. The campaign targeted the public and TDs to support their campaign to ensure that the clinically proven and licensed drug Spinraza being reimbursed in Ireland. Many TDs supported the families, yourself included, Taoiseach, and your Health Minister, Deputy Stephen Donnelly, who raised the issue in the Dáil and physically supported the families at the protests and AV room briefings. At the time, Ireland was the only one of the Benelux initiative that hadn't approved the funding of Spinraza. It was eventually approved on the 11th of June last year, 2019, and the families involved in the campaign and people affected by the illness were hugely relieved that their children could access this drug. I received a phone call from one of the families just last Thursday that 12 children are still waiting to commence treatment. One of those is a 17-year-old woman. Her father, Pat, emailed me the following. I'm looking for your help as the situation with my daughter is totally unacceptable. My daughter is deteriorating at an alarming rate while 391 days since Spinraza was approved and sits on a shelf while my daughter lives in constant pain and discomfort. And his daughter sent a note with it. She said, my case at the moment is that Spinraza, a life-changing drug for people with SMA, one of them being myself, was approved on the 11th of June in 2019. I've still received no access to it. Each day my muscles and body is getting weaker. When I was 12 I lost my ability to walk, and by now at 17 I've lost the ability to lift my arms up over my shoulders, brush my hair, turn myself over at night, and even go to the toilet and having a shower alone. I need assistance to do every little thing. I've lost so much quality of my life that I know Spinraza could bring back. Since my muscles have gotten weaker, I'm suffering from extremely bad anxiety. It's gotten to the stage that I can't leave my house without my man being by my side, and I'm so anxious that I'm not able to sleep alone in my own room downstairs without panicking. Now, her neurologist has been in contact with the HSE before the pandemic, and they were being told there's no beds available, that they can't follow up the care that's needed, and that's why they hadn't, this young woman hadn't been able to access the Spinraza. So, Taoiseach, to ask you, why is this the case? Can you find out? The people concerned, the 12 people waiting for the treatment, are concerned that the money or funding has stopped or something. They're not being told, explained as to what's happening. So can you find out what's happened with these 12 children and provide a timeline as to when their treatment will commence? I understand the COVID has impacted across our healthcare services, but they should be given some sort of a timeline and told that you will be brought in at a certain date. Thank you.
Thank the Deputy for raising this issue, and I certainly will do what I can to find out what is going on here in relation to those 12 children, and particularly the 17-year-old young woman that you referenced in your presentation. And I do remember the campaign and the huge commitment by the families involved. There is an ongoing issue with orphan drugs, drugs that are developed for what are classed as small populations in particular disease categories. I don't know why there are 12 children remaining right now. I will follow that up and see what we can do to try and facilitate their access to the drug, and I will come back to you with a response. I'll have to talk to the Minister, obviously, in the Department of Health. Now, perhaps you might be able to forward the details of the individual to me or to my office, and I'll certainly do what I can to get to the bottom of this and to try and find out what is actually going on in terms of the access to this drug for those children concerned.
Taoiseach, Deputy Collins.
Thank you, Taoiseach. I think, 18 of them have started and are on the treatment, and 12 are still waiting. And this was happening before the restrictions, so I think it's really important that we do. You're talking a small number of people that need this treatment urgently. I really would appreciate if you could follow it up with your Minister, and I'll send over the email to you.
Taoiseach.
everyday matters to the people concerned. I certainly do that, and I appreciate the Deputy for raising it.
Thank you very much. That therefore concludes Leaders' questions. We move now to questions on promised legislation. Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald, please.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, access to affordable housing was arguably the biggest issue that arose in last February's general election, and little wonder, given that people had endured years of failed